Hi, this is David again, and I wanted to spend a little bit of time on chapter one. I'm not going to try and cover the whole chapter in a video. That would be really boring and dull to have to go through like an hour. So just in a few minutes at a time, I'll try and cover a few different pieces. First thing to understand is that in this class with business law, we're really focused on the civil side of the law as opposed to the criminal side. And the criminal side is what shows up a lot on TV shows and in movies, I know. And for criminal, that is where the state, and by that we could mean a city, a county, a state, like state of Washington, or the federal government, and all the power and authority of the state, the government, is coming after an individual or a company and saying your action is so grievous, so serious, that the people have actually granted authority to the government to enforce certain rules and laws against those individuals or those companies. And so in the criminal case, it's brought, and it literally says things like United States of America versus David Kroll, or Washington State versus David Kroll, to show kind of the importance of that. And criminal law is very important, but it's a whole separate area than business law, and so we don't spend a lot of time on it in this class. What we do spend time is on civil law, and if you can think of civil law is between parties, where if something's brought to court, it'll be maybe David Kroll versus South Seattle College, or if I had like an employment complaint or something like that, or an individual, David versus Lynn. Lynn's my wife's name, so I would never sue her, of course. But the idea is that civil law is between two parties, and I could actually sue the government, maybe because I had a contract with them and they didn't pay me money. If they hired me to perform some service, I could certainly sue them, or if I work for the government, I could sue them. But the idea is that the penalties involved are generally, in a civil case, have to do with money, trying to get money back, whereas in criminal case, the government's coming after you and they could throw you in jail, they could fine you, and they could even put you to death, and for some very serious things. Civil law, which again is what business law deals with, is more likely to result in some kind of monetary compensation. We had an agreement, you didn't pay me, so I need money. I worked for you and I didn't get my wages, so I'm looking for money. You ran through a red light and hit me with your car, so my car needs to be fixed, and I got injured, so I have hospital bills I need you to pay. Those are kind of civil laws, and that's mostly what business law class is going to cover, okay? And in civil cases, the parties are called the plaintiff. That's the individual that starts a legal action, a plaintiff. And or is this word right here is plaintiff. In the criminal case, again, we said it's actually prosecuted by the government, as opposed to a plaintiff here. In both sides, the person that responds is called a defendant. They are defending the claims brought by either the plaintiff or, on the criminal side, a prosecutor representing the government brings the criminal charge. Now, this chapter one also talks about sources of law, where the laws come from. And I'm going to talk about that just briefly, though. What most of us are aware of is that there's laws, that there's Congress, has a Senate and a House of Representatives, and they may pass a law, and then the president signs it and becomes enforceable. It's a law. Or down in Olympia, for this is the state of Washington, the legislature meets and we have a House, we have a Senate, and a governor signs it, and it can become a law. And that's what we think when we think of those types of things. Those are primary sources of law. They are written down. We can look at them online. And here's a code that's written down in kind of legalistic terms, and we read it. That's what they mean by a primary source of law, something that's been passed by a government agency at the state level, city of Seattle, King County, or Washington State, or the federal government level, and I can look it up, and there it is. I know what it is. Another source of law is what they'll call secondary sources, and these are really, they're not enforceable by themselves. but they have some influence. You could argue them, and the idea is that these are people who study the law, maybe judges, maybe attorneys, business people can do it, and they write articles. And they say, you know, the law should be this, we believe, or we should enforce these kinds of rules. We should adopt these types of uniform things. And they get published, and the hope is that they cause like the state legislature or the federal government to read those articles and think, yeah, we really should create a new law that matches that. So secondary sources of law can be referred to, but they aren't really laws that are enforceable by anybody. And we're going to talk about those more, especially with regards to contracts, because there have been some secondary sources of law that specifically deal with business rules, and they have been adopted by the states. And we'll talk about those later on, but those are secondary sources. Another aspect, excuse me, before I go on to that, I'll stick with the slides order here, is the Constitution is the founding document of our country, the United States Constitution, and it is often referred to as the supreme law of the land. It is the primary source of laws and rules from it, and from the Constitution, all the government at the federal level receives its power from the people. When we accepted this Constitution as kind of our guiding document, it said there will be a federal government. The federal government will have three branches: a legislative branch, an executive branch, and a judicial branch. And here is the various powers that each of those branches can have from the people. Okay, this is the people granting that authority to them, to these branches of government. Just like there's this federal constitution, each of the states, each of the 50 United States, have their own state constitution. There is a written document of Washington State Constitution, which is very similar in the way it's written to our United States Constitution. It creates a legislature that's down in Olympia. It has a Senate and a House of Representatives in Olympia. And it has an executive branch, which is the governor in the case of Washington. And we have a court system that's set up at the state level. And all the 50 states have a similar structure to them. The US Constitution and the state constitutions are the primary source of legal authority for the United States. The Bill of Rights, which is also referenced on the slide here, is just the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. And historically, what happened is when they wrote the Constitution and they were trying to get it ratified, people were concerned. They said, well, this creates a federal government, and that's great, but we're worried that it doesn't limit some of the abuses that we felt we were endured under Britain when we were still a colony. In other words, there weren't enough restrictions in the language of the US Constitution when it was first written to say, hey, government, you can't do these things. And so in order to get the Constitution approved or ratified, they actually at the same time wrote, here's the first 10 amendments to the Constitution that we're going to immediately pass and accept and make them part of this document. And the Bill of Rights, these first 10 amendments to the Constitution, are restrictions on what the government can do to individuals. And that you'll remember, probably the one that everybody remembers is the First Amendment provides for our freedom of speech, freedom to practice and exercise your religion. And it's those, and the other 9 amendments are restrictions, specific restrictions say, yes, we'll form this US federal government, but you can't do these things to the individual citizens of the government. And then once those were accepted, the Constitution became ratified and enforceable. I'm not sure. I like that.